In a landmark decision that will be studied for years, the Supreme Court has just overturned President Trump's sweeping tariff plan, marking a dramatic turning point in the ongoing debate over presidential power. The ruling sent shockwaves through both Washington and Wall Street, as lawmakers, investors, and business leaders scrambled to understand the full implications of the court's move. The decision is a direct and unmistakable rebuke of Trump's aggressive trade agenda, challenging the very foundation of his approach to international commerce and his reliance on executive authority. Inside the White House, the mood is nothing short of furious. Senior advisors and staffers are reeling, as the president views this as a direct attack on his ability to shape U.S. economic policy. The Supreme Court's ruling effectively dismantles the core of Trump's 2025 trade war, which had relied heavily on a series of executive orders to bypass congressional approval and impose tariffs on foreign goods. In a clear and forceful statement, the justices ruled that only Congress, not the president acting alone, has the constitutional authority to impose taxes and tariffs on imports, reaffirming the separation of powers. This historic verdict has thrown U.S. trade policy into chaos, with government officials now scrambling to find alternative strategies and global markets reacting with heightened uncertainty and volatility. Critics of Trump's trade war are hailing the decision as a major victory for the rule of law and constitutional checks and balances, while Trump's supporters are decrying it as an act of judicial overreach that undermines the executive branch. With this ruling, the White House has lost its most powerful trade weapon, leaving a significant gap in its policy arsenal and forcing a complete reassessment of its economic strategy moving forward. Now, the separation of powers and the future direction of U.S. economic policy are at the center of a national crisis, as the country grapples with the fallout from this unprecedented Supreme Court intervention. To truly understand the Supreme Court's impact on U.S. trade policy, it's important to first examine the scale and ambition of Trump's 2025 trade strategy, a plan that sent shockwaves through global markets and redefined America's approach to international commerce. Consider the magnitude of Trump's sweeping tariff plan, which targeted nearly every product entering the country. In early 2025, the administration imposed a blanket 10% tariff on almost all imports, aiming to rebalance America's trade deficit overnight and send a clear message to trading partners that the U.S. would no longer tolerate what it saw as unfair practices. China, in particular, faced even harsher penalties, with tariffs on some key exports soaring as high as 125%. This move was designed to pressure Beijing on both economic and geopolitical fronts. Additional reciprocal tariffs hit Canada and Mexico, while so-called fentanyl tariffs targeted China, all justified as responses to unfair trade, intellectual property theft, and the ongoing crisis of drug trafficking across U.S. borders. The underlying strategy was clear: use economic pressure as leverage to achieve political goals, revive U.S. manufacturing, and bring jobs back to American soil. Supporters hailed the plan as a bold and necessary correction to decades of what they saw as failed trade policies that hurt American workers and industries. But critics quickly warned of looming supply chain chaos, higher prices for everyday goods, and the risk of sparking a global trade war. Businesses saw their costs soar, retailers struggled to keep shelves stocked as price hikes rippled through the economy, and global supply chains began to unravel, causing delays and uncertainty for companies and consumers alike. The White House insisted the pain was only temporary, promising that the long-term benefits would outweigh the short-term disruptions. Still, many economists and labor leaders warned of rising inflation, job losses, and the risk of a prolonged economic downturn. This aggressive, high-stakes approach set the stage for a dramatic legal showdown, as states, businesses, and foreign governments challenged the administration's authority. Now, with the Supreme Court's decision, the entire strategy has been upended, leaving the future of U.S. trade policy hanging in the balance. The legal fight over tariffs quickly escalated into a high-stakes constitutional showdown, drawing national attention to the limits of presidential power. President Trump invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or EPA, arguing that the nation's trade deficits and the influx of fentanyl from abroad constituted national emergencies that demanded immediate action. By framing these economic and public health issues as emergencies, Trump sought to justify sweeping new tariffs on foreign goods, bypassing the usual legislative process. Critics, including many legal scholars and members of Congress, argued that IEEPA was never intended to be used as a tool for broad trade policy. Instead, they said, it was designed for targeted sanctions against hostile nations or specific threats, not for reshaping the entire U.S. trade landscape. The case moved rapidly through the courts and soon reached the federal circuit. There, judges determined that President Trump had overstepped the authority granted to him by Congress, setting a crucial legal precedent. The U.S. Constitution is clear: the power to impose taxes and tariffs rests with Congress, not the president. This foundational principle is meant to ensure that no single branch of government can unilaterally control the nation's economic policy. When the case reached the Supreme Court, even justices appointed by Trump expressed skepticism about granting the executive branch unlimited authority to impose tariffs under the guise of an emergency. The justices pressed government lawyers, questioning whether economic issues like trade deficits or drug imports truly qualified as emergencies under the IEEPA, or if this was an overreach of executive power. In its majority opinion, the court made it clear: the president cannot simply rewrite tariff laws by executive order, no matter how urgent the situation may seem. Allowing such unchecked power, the court warned, would fundamentally upend the delicate balance between Congress and the White House, undermining the separation of powers at the heart of American democracy. The ruling reasserts that even in times of crisis or emergency, the separation of powers must be respected, and the president cannot bypass Congress to achieve policy goals. In the end, the administration's attempt to sidestep Congress was firmly rejected, reinforcing the constitutional safeguards that protect American democracy from executive overreach. The Supreme Court's ruling has triggered a rush by American companies to reclaim billions paid in tariffs. Businesses like Costco, anticipating the decision, filed lawsuits to protect their right to refunds. The key issue: if tariff payments were finalized before the ruling, companies risked losing their claims. Now, the government faces the prospect of refunding tens or even hundreds of billions, straining the federal budget. For many companies, these refunds are crucial for survival after months of higher costs. The Court of International Trade is bracing for a flood of claims. While companies may get their money back, consumers who paid higher prices likely won't see refunds. The failed tariff policy leaves businesses scrambling and everyday Americans footing the bill. Even before the Supreme Court's decision, the Trump administration was preparing alternatives. The White House is pivoting to older trade laws, like Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, which allows tariffs after a formal investigation of unfair practices. Section 232 of the 1962 Trade Expansion Act, used for national security tariffs, is also on the table. These options require lengthy investigations, but the administration is moving quickly to reimpose tariffs. More obscure laws, like Section 122 and Section 338, are being considered for immediate action, though they carry legal risks. The administration is determined to maintain its protectionist stance, no matter the legal hurdles. The Supreme Court's ruling has created a tariff gap, a period with no broad tariffs in place. This weakens the administration's leverage in trade negotiations and complicates ongoing talks with countries like China. The government now faces massive refund liabilities, creating a fiscal headache for the Treasury. While some tariffs, like those on steel and aluminum, remain, the most ambitious parts of Trump's agenda are derailed. Any new tariffs will require slower, more bureaucratic processes. The court's decision reaffirms that Congress controls trade policy, not the president alone. This ruling will shape presidential trade powers for years to come. The balance of power in U.S. economic policy has been fundamentally reset. The future is uncertain for the administration, businesses, and consumers. The White House will push for new tariffs under stricter legal constraints, prolonging trade tensions. Businesses face ongoing unpredictability, making long-term planning difficult. The temporary tariff gap may lower some prices, but new tariffs and global retaliation could drive costs higher. The lack of stable trade policy is a drag on the economy and job creation. For consumers, the fallout means continued price swings and economic anxiety. The Supreme Court's decision has resolved one constitutional issue but opened new political and economic battles. For now, uncertainty is the only certainty in America's trade future.